Hey students, we're going to do phase shifts today. And now let me show you, first of all, these are like the standard forms of sine and cosine. A times sine of bx minus c plus k, and A is your amplitude. And normally we have an h there. I don't really like this form. This is the vertical shift. And typically you'll have the bx minus h. Here they use c in your book, but whether or not it's b over c or ah, whatever, b over c is considered your phase shift. But I'm not a big fan of that because people forget to turn the negative, they forget what it is. But there's an old thing that you've done for years that I think will be helpful. If you will just set whatever is in parentheses. And by the way, if you have a phase shift, it will be in parentheses. You set the entire parentheses equal to 0 and just solve for the unknown. So in this case, you would take x minus pi over 4 and make it equal to 0. You're already used to doing this with rational equations, polynomial equations, quadratics. So you're just going to use that old zero product property to figure out what it is. And here, this means x is equal to pi over 4. So that's how I would like you to remember how to find the phase shift and trying to remember some formula. Now, once you determine the phase shift, you're almost done. It's not really hard. It's so much like the other functions, and let me show you how. Step 1 is you'll find the period. So I've written that down for you. This is the example we're doing. And step 1 is find the period by taking 2 pi over b. So in this case, it's just going to be 2 pi, right? Because the b is 1. Step 2, for phase shift, instead of beginning your input chart with a 0 like you normally do, I want your first input value to be the phase shift itself. So if I start my chart, the first thing in this case is going to be pi over 4 because we determined that was a phase shift. So I guess I should have said step 2 is set the parentheses equal to 0 and find phase shift. So I think I'll add that. Okay, so I added it. Step 2, set the parentheses equal to 0 and find the phase shift. So in this case, number 2 was pi over 4. For step 3, for the phase shift, instead of beginning your input chart with 0, your first input will be the phase shift itself. And then step 4, add the period to the phase shift and make that the fifth entry or value. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I'm going to take 2 pi plus pi over 4. Well, I want them both to have, if I take 2 pi plus pi over 4, if I take 2 and make it in fourths, that's 8/4, right? In other words, 2 over 1 is what over 4? If I want the same denominator, multiply the bottom by 4, the top by 4, and it's 8/4. And I add that pi plus pi over 4, and that's 9 pi over 4. Okay, so now I have the first and the fifth. Now I'm going to find the third one by doing the midpoint. So I've written that down. Use the midpoint formula to find the middle value, which is, in fact, to add the first and the fifth and divide by 2. Now don't worry about the pi, I'll add that later. But if I take 1/4 plus 9/4, I get 10/4, right? I just need half of that, which is, you can multiply it by 1/2 if you'd like. It's going to simplify anyway. 5/4. Okay, now I'm going to repeat that process. Now I'm going to find the second by adding the first and the third. 1/4 plus 5/4 equals 6/4. Half of that is going to be 3/4. And stick that pi in there. And now what's halfway between 5 and 9? You can kind of figure that out, right? It's 7. There we go. Okay, for those of you who really like notes, who like to write down everything, I've written down that I've done that again for the second and for the fourth. Now we're going to evaluate to find the output, the y value. Okay, so now we're going to evaluate. I wrote that down if you want to see it. Here it is. You can just freeze and write that down if you'd like. But let's just go through the process. Here we go. If I put pi over 4 in for x, pi over 4 minus pi over 4 is 0. And the sign at 0 is 0 times 2 is 0. Because you remember, you're just using the unit circle and the 4 quadrantals where the x value is your cosine and the y value is your sine. We just did this one. Now if I put 3 pi in there, 3 pi minus pi over 4 lands me up top. The sign there is 1 times 2 is 2. Now plug the third value in. 5 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 is pi. Lands you right here as it should, which is -1 for the sign. 0 for the sign, 0 times 2 is 0. And now 7 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 lands you down here because it's 6 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 2. So you're down here where the sign is -1 times 2 is -2. And now finally 9 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 gives you 8 pi over 4, which is 2 pi. You're right here, the sign is 0. And there you go. And that's how you do a phase shift. And you simply have to graph this now. And every time I do this, I always use those x values to number my graph, which is what I'm doing here. 7 pi over 4, 9 pi over 4, and then of course it's 0. Oh, it was a phase shift. It's 0, and then 2, and then 0, and -2, and then 0. And of course, as always, please don't make V's. If you mess up, then just do it again. Don't do those V's. But this is just one cycle, right? You need to continue. You know how the pattern goes. Just continue it so that you can have at least 2 cycles and fill in your values. Okay? All right, that concludes phase shifts. Works the same way with cosines. Write down all these for your book, your composition book, so you'll have those notes. And you guys take care.